It seems to me so much of this comes down to sort of embedded ways of thinking and refusing to kind of embrace newer ways of thinking. So, as you come along and you explain a more compassionate approach through looking at this idea of dislocation. Similar, parenting is one thing that you just touched on, this idea of, subcultures who sort of have been historically exploited. That is the reason, that is the root cause of their having a worse addiction problem. So really, it's always about looking at these big societal problems as a whole.
That's right. If you look at dislocation, which is really a separation from our true selves and a separation from our culture and from other people, the more dislocation there is in a society, the more addiction you're going to see. And if you look at, for example, England in the 18th century, what happened is that you had this gin craze. People started just drinking gin. But what was going on at the same time? Enclosures were happening. People were being forced off the land. The communal lands were being taken over by the big landowners, forcing people into the cities to work in these dark satanic mills, to quote William Blake, these factories of the arising capitalist economic system. Total dislocation. Along with that, you had a rise in addiction. So that you can never separate these individual behaviors from social factors.
One of the other things we spoke about this, in fact, when you were last here, and I know it was the subject very much of your last book, which was about a failure to understand the connection between mind and body. It strikes me that we are doing better at that. You talk about this dislocation in modern medicine between understanding that what's going on in the body is so influenced by the mind and how adversely that affects the way we treat illness. Do you think over the last years that is something that we are addressing as a society?
I wish I could say so. What is true is that there's much more awareness. I mean, for my new book, I collected something like multiple thousands of research papers, which have been generated at increasing quantity and quality over the last decades. The problem is that that research awareness has not entered clinical practice yet. So literally most physicians wouldn't know what the heck I was talking about right now, not through their education. The average medical student in North America, and I would gauge in the UK as well, never gets a single lecture on trauma or its impacts on brain development. They don't get a single lecture on unity of mind and body, which is only non-controversial medical fact, or scientific fact, I should say. So there's a little, let alone on a social level, where we're still fighting this war on drugs, which is really a war on, there's no war on inanimate objects. You can't war on drugs. There's a war on drug addicts. In other words, there's a war on the more traumatized sections of our population. So on the one hand, we have this incontrovertible and voluminous research information, of which there's more and more awareness. More and more groups, more and more people are embracing this new knowledge. But that new knowledge, sadly, has yet to penetrate much of medical practice, including addiction treatment, and certainly the legal system or social policy. So there's a gap. There's what I would call a science policy gap.
And you say, so where I was thinking about that reading your book was very much to do with the treatments that you suggest, and we won't have time to go into all the various ways that you look at it. We've talked a lot about this idea of showing compassion towards addicts, more compassion towards addicts, but one of the most important things that you write about is the notion of the power of compassionate curiosity, compassion towards ourselves. And that's what I was getting at when I was wondering whether you think things have improved. You talk a lot about this very interesting idea of mental hygiene and the idea of sort of looking at ourselves much more to examine what's going on, to kind of look at the patterns we are following, examine our addictions, see where they come from. That is essentially mindfulness, which we do talk about and try, I think, to incorporate in society more today than perhaps we have in the past.
Yes, that's true. And I see that as a really positive trend. But mindfulness needs to be associated, or at least allied with, deep curiosity and insight as well. And so if you're an addicted person or somebody who's had addictions, listen to this conversation. You need to be compassionate to yourself. You need to say, no, what's wrong with me? But why did I do all that? What purpose did it serve? Oh, it helps soothe my pain. Well, that's a totally different approach. If you're a parent or a relative of somebody with addictive patterns, instead of what's wrong with them? Why don't they give it up? You can say, well, why don't they give it up? What is it doing for them? What's the benefit? And what were the circumstances in their lives that encompassed the whole multi-generational family system that gave rise to their pain? And sometimes people say, well, yeah, well, how come three kids grow up in the same family and one of them becomes an addict and the other one doesn't? Good question. Two answers. One is, no two children grow up in the same family. No two children have the same parents, because they come along at different stages of the parents' lives. The parents see them differently, and they are different in the birth order, so there's different pressures on them, number one. Number two, there is such a thing as genetic sensitivity. Not genetic addiction. Addiction is not a disease, and it's certainly not a genetic disease. But if a child is more sensitive, then the same events will have a much greater impact on them. So the more sensitive you are, the more hurt you're going to be. The more creative you're going to be, the more intuitive you're going to be, and the more hurt you're going to be. The more hurt you are, the more you have to escape from your pain. So the great British child psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott said once that if a mother could be the same mother to all 8 of her children, which she couldn't be, he said, but if she could be, they still would have 8 different mothers, because they would all be experiencing her through their own particular temperament.
It's interesting, though, the sort of idea you bring up actually of sensitivity, because one of the things that one of your patients said to you was the importance of having a soft heart. And we're talking about compassion, the importance of showing ourselves more compassion when we're trying to, as a cure, as a way of getting out of it. So it is a careful balance, because soft-heartedness and compassion seems to me where you end up as being one of the most important ways to overcome an addiction.
Well, if we want people to give up their addictions, if our goal is to help them become fully who they are, where they don't have this emptiness that they have to keep filling from the outside, they need a lot of compassion. And compassion, I distinguish on several different levels. There is the compassion of just ordinary human compassion, which is, I don't like to see people suffer. I don't like people to suffer. That's good. That's healthy. That's natural, but it's not enough. It has to be deepened by the compassion of understanding, where you actually say, not only do I not want this person to suffer, I want to understand why they're suffering. Otherwise, how can I help them? So then you start asking these questions that I've been addressing in this conversation. On the third level, there's what I call the compassion of recognition, where you see that, they're not different from me. I recognize the same things in myself. Therefore, I'm in no position to be above them, to judge them. We're two people, equal, in significant ways, sharing the same experience. And I could go on, but there's different levels of compassion, but it's absolutely essential for helping addicted people. And as one of my teachers, A.H. Alma, says, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. You want people to see the truth? they can only do so when they feel safe.
And if you are talking to people who are listening, who are here to support families, friends, caregivers, you have a note to them at the end of your book. Ultimately, it must come from the addict themselves.
Yes. So my advice to families, parents, caregivers, adult children, friends of people with addictions is that there's 3 ways you can be in relationship to your addicted relative or friend. 2 of them are insane. 1 of them is sane. One way is you can be in their lives and try to change them. That's insane. It means that you're codependent. It means that your feeling better depends on them feeling better. So now you're dependent on somebody who's dependent. That's what codependency means. Doesn't work. Because the basic trauma that we all experience, and it doesn't take abuse or terrible circumstances, is that we're not accepted for who we were. Now, if you want to approach your addicted client or friend or relative with the same, I don't accept who you are, I want you to be different for me to be happy, that's to invite resistance. It's insanity.
So do
The
you
other, yeah, the other ways to be in their lives is I'll be in your life and I'll let you walk all over me, and I'll sacrifice myself no matter how much I'm hurt by what you do. That's also insane. What is sane, if the other person's behavior to themselves is causing you too much pain, you can't handle it, to say to them, look, I love you very much. I can't handle the pain that I feel when I see you. So right now I cannot be in your life. That's totally healthy. But the only sane way to be in their lives is to say, I see that what you're doing is something you need to do right now. Why you need to do it, that's your own affair. But I'm here to support you and to love you. But I'm not going to take on trying to change you. That's the only sane thing to do.
Before I hand over to the audience for what I'm sure will be many, many interesting questions, can I ask you about something? You say that people who are trying to come out of an addiction find often the most difficult of the 12 steps, which is something that many people turn to. I think it's step number 2, which is the idea of needing to fill this void we've spoken about a lot over the past hour with something spiritual. With a God, essentially. And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more of that. People find that there are people who find that an uncomfortable idea. Is that a necessary way of curing an addiction? Do you need a belief in a higher power to be there with you?
Well, yes and no. The 12 steps in themselves, I find they're very essential steps for a healthy, balanced life, addicted or not addicted. Mm. Unfortunately, they arose out of a tradition of what was essentially fundamentalist Christianity. So they're framed in those terms. And for a lot of people who might have grown up in where religion was beaten down their throats when they were children, it's disconcerting and repulsive to be told that now you have to believe in a God in order to heal. But if you see beyond the language, the sense of a higher power does not imply some entity in the sky. Doesn't have to. It can if that's what you believe. Doesn't need to. I certainly don't. Never have. But when you say higher power, higher than what? Well, there's my little conditioned ego with its fears and its emptiness and its self-serving beliefs and its defensiveness, its belief that I'm not lovable, that I'm not good enough. Well, there's the higher power in me, which is my deeper awareness that there's more to my reality than just that. And there's my innate goodness and conscience and capacity to see beyond the machinations of my little narcissistic ego, which, believes me, is a very active force in my mind. I confront it every day. I deal with it every day. So there's something higher than that. And that's your higher power. If you want to take it to some spiritual level of universal unity, connection, Christ nature, Buddha nature, that's fine. Nobody can prescribe that for you. But yeah, there's something higher in all of us than our little egos. And that's what the higher power means to me.
There are so many more things we could talk about, but I feel I mustn't dominate the rest, because we've got time now for the bit that I know you want, looking forward to getting to, which is of course welcoming other people in to ask their questions. So as Esme said at the beginning, if you I mean, would you want to pose an initial question again, Gabor, or shall I invite people to pose theirs? Did you want to ask one?
No, you know what? I think I've answered that one. That's just about what does the addiction do for you? And I think I kind of preempted that one by giving you the various answers I've received already. So we don't need to deal with that one.
Okay. So if I could invite you to then ask your questions into the chat box, then we will pick you to turn your camera on if you want, and then you can ask the question in vision or not if you choose. I'm just going to wait for the questions to come in, and while I do, can I just revisit a point that you were talking about at the end about the crux of this being authenticity, and what making us ill, you know, in a modern world is that we crave authenticity and yet we can't find it. People are sort of always, it's roles or labels or a sort of persona that society puts on us. And perhaps you could explain a little bit about, can we, the detrimental effect that has on our health, essentially, this idea that we find it very hard to live as our authentic and true selves.
Well, in a nutshell, we find it hard to live as our authentic true selves because in childhood that wasn't accepted and celebrated and recognized by our rearing environment. Our parents were too stressed and too separated from themselves to really embrace our own authenticity. So we had to give it up in order to survive. So it becomes very uncomfortable to be ourselves in a society that celebrates inauthenticity. But if you ask yourself this question, that have you ever noticed yourself being inauthentic? That you're in a situation and afterwards you said to yourself, oh, I wasn't really myself. Or most people would say yes. Then the question is, who's noticing that? What in you is noticing that? That's your authentic self noticing it. See, your authentic self never was destroyed. You just lost touch with it. And it can always be regained. It's the subject of another book of mine, When the Body Says No, which I did talk to the How To Academy when I was in London, that the separation from the true self imposes all kinds of compensations and behaviors that lead to illness. That's a whole other subject, which I really can't begin to address here.
Okay, so somebody asks, what causes certain events or occurrences to trigger addiction in us at a later point in life?
Usually there's some template already in childhood, and then some stress happens. So for example, and one of the functions of addiction is to regulate the stress apparatus inside of yourself. So if you infuse animals with the stress hormone, cortisol, they're more likely to use alcohol and cocaine to soothe themselves because it helps to regulate the stress apparatus. The same with humans. So if there's some extreme stress that you don't know how to handle in your life, then you're more likely to move into addiction. And that's why during the COVID situation, more people are using substances and more people engaging in addictive behaviors. So it's usually there's a childhood template there, whether you realize it or not, and then some stress in adulthood that you don't know how to handle.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mate, for what you spoke about and your, your kind of honesty and candour around your own experiences. So I have a background in personal recovery for of 12-step groups, and I'm also a big fan of your work, and I work in the field. And sometimes I feel like I struggle to kind of hold the line between that kind of what does it do for you question, and then the taking responsibility piece, like for the impact that it's having on the life of the individual, the life of the people around them. And I can almost kind of feel a conflict in me sometimes, especially with that backdrop of personal recovery that I've got. And I wondered what your, any clinical experience or thoughts you might have on that.
So your goal, as mine, is to help people take responsibility, because if they don't, nobody else can. So that's the ultimate goal. But the question is, how do we help people gain responsibility? How do we help people gain the ability to respond, response ability? How do we help people attain that? By removing the shame. Because when people are defending against shame, it's hard for them to take responsibility. They'll take on blame and guilt, but they will not take on responsibility. So there's no contradiction between that question, what is it doing for you, and your intention to help people take responsibility. And I would say, and I'm not going to go into this with you right now, but if you and I were working privately, if you have a conflict with that inside of yourself, which I understand, I would say maybe you haven't quite resolved the issue yet within yourself. And that's something you could do. Okay? And by the way, any of us that work in addiction, you know where our biggest work is? Right here, with ourselves. The more we can clear ourselves, the clearer we can be with our clients. So thank you for your question.